set in Pakistan when it was still India. Our guests are singer and human rights activist Joan Baez, playwright Stuart Parker, novelist Margaret Drabble, and Indian writer Farooq Dondi. Take a beautiful voice, a sense of injustice, and a time of ferment. Joan Baez had it all, and her achingly pure voice was the conscience of the hippie generation. At her height, she was able to persuade President Carter to send in the American fleet to rescue Vietnam's boat people. Her memoirs range over her rich love life, especially her affair with Bob Dylan, her friendship and work with Martin Luther King, and her courageous visit to Hanoi during a period of saturation bombing by the Americans. Joan, was your book ghosted?
No. I love to write. I enjoy it, and I even enjoyed pretending to be like regular people and staying home and not packing suitcases for sometimes 4 months at a time. And I'd get up very early in the morning and make a fire in the kitchen. And I used a typewriter for the first couple of years, and then I was finally seduced to the word processor.
What about the politics? I mean, you've been described as very political, but in fact, you've been criticized by both the far left and the far right, haven't you, in your time?
Well, then I consider I must be doing something right, because it's my opinion, and I hope that came through in the book from just the involvements in the stories and what took place, that oppression is oppression, whether it's administered by the right wing or the left wing. And that one of the things that's so difficult for people to do is really detach themselves from their ideology so that they can see that clearly.
Because you've been called a KGB agent and a CIA rat, haven't you?
Yeah, I'm waiting for them all to pay up and then I'll be rich.
And what do you think was the bravest thing you did in the face of unpopularity?
Oh, I suppose that probably after I got started, I realized how difficult it would be, and that was the open letter to Hanoi.
Yes.
1979, criticizing the human rights violations inside of Hanoi, because then that was to the left wing in most parts of the world, except places where they really had arrived at that conclusion ahead of time, like
yes.
France. And the United States was behind, as usual, and didn't want to deal with disillusionment with the revolutionary government of Hanoi.
Well, Stuart, did you enjoy this book?
I did enjoy it, and I enjoyed it particularly because it's a serious book, if I can say that. It's not a show business book, it's about serious issues. It seemed to me to have a theme, which I found very interesting, and the theme was survival. The survival of yourself as a human being, the difficulty of surviving in the music business when fashions change, and finally, what I thought was the best written chapter in the book, the last one, where you have a conversation with your father about the survival of the species. But on the way there, you say something that really teased and intrigued me, and I wanted to hear more. It's the end of the chapter where you talk about the 25th reunion concert in the Boston club where you started out. And you end up saying, all of us alive are survivors, but how many of us transcend survival? And I didn't quite know what that meant.
Do you know where I heard that was Jesse Jackson, I realize now, and I don't know whether I heard it before or after I wrote that. But we tend to talk about surviving as though that were something ultimate. And I really think it has to be something beyond survival, that survival is just the base level. And when as long as we're breathing and walking around, or probably not even walking around, but breathing, we're surviving. But then what beyond that? I mean, what gives our lives quality and what gives our lives depth? And so I think in the chapter about Club 47, I was talking about my sister who has survived lots of unpleasantries, and to me, clearly transcended being just a survivor by being so beautiful that evening and singing so beautifully and giving. You know, it had to do with the heart.
So is the book for you transcending survival, that you've managed to add something to merely going on living and being well known?
Well, for me, I wouldn't look at it as just trying to survive, except for the times when I've been terribly, terribly unhappy. I mean, I feel as though my life has been very, very blessed and very full. And I guess I want it to come across in the book that I really don't take anything for granted. I mean, I'm constantly in a state of grace about what a fortunate position I'm in. And that has to do with wanting to share that at the same time.
Margaret, what did you feel about the Quaker background and the roots of her pacifism that emerged?
I was particularly interested in that, having been to a Quaker school myself. I mean, it certainly does make a very deep impression on one, and it's almost impossible to get away from. And your social conscience continues to activate you. But in the 80s, the social conscience is rather out of fashion, and I'd really like to ask you how you feel about the 80s, and are you going to write sort of the next volume of your book? It'll be a different volume.
Well, I just feel as though the 80s and the 70s have been a time during which maybe the most important thing for anybody, well, I consider to be a sane thinker, is simply to go on being sane. It's not a time in which it's possible to have great movements or for social change. And so I don't think we need to get panicky about that. I don't think you can force it ahead of time, but I do think the quality of the next movement rests considerably on the nature of what we do with ourselves now and how we conduct ourselves. And if we remember to be compassionate, if we remember human decency, and those are very hard to keep track of in the 80s.
Do you see it as a kind of waiting time?
I do see it as a kind of waiting time, and I also am very grateful to be going through my 40s because I don't think I would have been able to stand to wait when I was 20.
But how do you feel, Farouk, about the humor in the book? I found it extremely humorous. Did you find this? That was what surprised me about it.
I found essentially that the book is an extremely candid book. It's very straightforward. Let me say that Joan Baez and Bob Dylan and other such figures were, for me, coming from India, having been in school and college there, and they were bursting onto the scene. They were very special people for me because they changed my perception as an Indian of America. Suddenly I realized that there were refuseniks and dissidents in America. The problem was that the only access you could get to their songs and what they were doing was through the United States Information Service building in Bombay. And some of my friends were picketing it. So the best thing was to do was go and listen to the records in the morning and picket it in the afternoon. And it really gave one the feeling that something new was happening in America. And so I looked for that in the book. I found it there. I found that, in a sense, I knew all about you before I read the book. I could have pictured precisely what you did. It just shows how good the American propaganda machine is.
That's a terrific conclusion.
So you didn't find any surprises?
I didn't find the surprises. I found the portrait of Bob Dylan exactly as I would have expected from having listened to Diamonds and Rust, which in a sense summed up your entire Bob Dylan oeuvre of the book.
I mean, I needn't have written all this.
You
stuff
needn't have written
about
all
it.
that. Diamonds and Rust told me, in essence, what you were saying about it. And I know the song by heart.
Well, Stuart, what were the surprises you found?
Well, the kind of thing surprised me from I mean, ranging across all the subject matter, that I would have thought that coming out of the sort of Harvard Square literary intellectual milieu and being a campus child, that literature would have actually influenced you a good deal. But all the way through the book, there's very little reference to it. And that surprised me. I suppose that you started singing so young and you were so caught up in the music business that you hadn't much time for that.
I think it's also my absolutely sturdy rebellion against any form of education. I mean, I was told to read, so I didn't read, and assumed that I could get by without that sort of thing. And it isn't really until recently that I've begun to be able to enjoy reading.
Can I go on to something perhaps more serious, which is the political content? One of the things that I missed in the book, and it's a long book and it's full of meat, but I wish that when you told us about your involvement in specific political campaigns, that you followed through on it. If I just pull out two examples. You supported the mothers of the disappeared in Argentina, and in a sense that turned out to have some kind of successful outcome in that Argentina now has a form of democracy. You supported the peace women in Ireland. Well, that movement collapsed in acrimony and recrimination and left a terrible legacy of disillusionment and cynicism. And I wanted to hear what you thought about that. I was looking for another section saying, well, this is what happened after I went and joined the march or went and sang at a concert, and how you felt about it.
The criticism that I accept wholeheartedly of myself, and it's been somewhat useful for me, although I don't know whether I really have the capacity to change, is that I really, it's so narcissistic, the writing, that it's really only, a story is only as I related to it then directly in relation to me, and so that fit exactly with what you're saying. Well, so then after you left, you know, what happened then?
But still, you put your clout into these particular movements and you drew the world's attention to them, which was something. I mean, you can't be... Hercules. You can't.
No, and also I think at some point, because the length of the book already, it is exactly what did it happen. I mean, how did I remember it? And I'm certain, and I buy out of that in the first paragraph somewhere, saying I have a big imagination and selective memory. Yeah. And so when somebody says that's not what was said, I remember it, then they're going to remember their version, and so on. So it really is as you remember it, you know, as you were there.
And you did something rather extraordinary. I think you suddenly go into the second person. You suddenly address you, Bob. You suddenly talk to.
And that was absolutely unconscious. Apparently, I did it 5 or 6 times in the book, and it never. It was not a conscious effort. It just happened.
Did that bother anybody?
It's very effective, I think, because you feel as though you've lost your self-consciousness about writing the book at all, and you're just going into a kind of stream of consciousness.
Yeah. I liked it very much when you addressed your child, your son, and spoke to him and said sorry about certain things, but that's just the way it is. I thought the tone of that was very good. I'd love to know what he thinks of it.
I haven't the faintest idea, and I thought maybe in 12 years or so he might cast a little glance at the book, but I wouldn't expect before then.
That first person address didn't bother me. I thought, here goes Diamonds and Rust again.
You saw it all in terms of the songs.
I saw it all in terms of a songwriter's prerogative
That's a real fan,
to talk directly to the person.
But can I ask about music? Because one of the things that was a surprise to me was that you didn't seem to have stayed in touch very much with the music scene in the 70s and 80s. You talk about feeling that the music scene has passed you by, but in a way it read to me as though you'd lost interest in it. I mean, it was quite a shock when you come to the Live Aid chapter, and it's the first time you've seen U2. And as a Pretenders fan, I was greatly shocked that you never heard Chrissie Hynde.
But you see, when you say music scene, the music scene that I was really the most deeply involved in was the scene which passed, and that was the ballads in Harvard Square. And that didn't keep my interest. I was not interested in staying with that forever. So then the next music scene that there was, I was always marginal to that. For some reason or another, I went on making records that people were interested in buying, up to a point.
But